Well, at the moment, we have two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, who have voted seemingly overwhelmingly for independence from Kiev. But the results of those elections are so uncannily high that, for example, the UK Foreign Secretary has said that the votes from the Eurovision Song Contest are more credible, and we all know what happened to the public voting with that. So at the end of the day, these results aren't going to be recognised by anyone but Moscow and the people of the separatists in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, on 25th of May, when Ukraine proper goes to the polls, those results will be recognised by the rest of the world, apart from Moscow and the separatists in eastern Ukraine. So that's a somewhat farcical situation, but the reality on the ground is that people are dying, and in Donetsk alone, for example, more than 50 people have already been killed since the government so-called anti-terrorist operations in the region began. People have been wondering whether he actually had a game plan, because for example, just before the separatist elections, he had actually asked for a pause in those, for a chance for dialogue, and that made it seem as if things were actually almost running away from him. Things were happening too quickly. But if we wind back to when the former president, Viktor Yanukovych, was deposed, that really prompted a very clear course of action for Putin. He had actually lost the buffer zone that he had between Russia and NATO and the West, in that Ukraine at the time was a very Moscow-leaning country in its presidency. And he stood, as a consequence of the ousting of Yanukovych, to lose the Black Sea Fleet's port in Crimea at Sevastopol. So it seemed quite obvious, and it does seem obvious now in hindsight, that he would want to move to at least secure Sevastopol, and that's exactly what he's done. And of course we now have an annexed Crimea. Looking towards the east of the country, the agitation that has occurred, the separatism supported by Russian elements and also by elements formerly allied to Yanukovych, has also created that buffer zone. And from the West's point of view, it looks messy, but the Russians don't really care about that. And if it carries on being messy, it's fine by them, because the buffer zone is there and it's job done. Well, I think Putin will continue to raise or lower tensions at will, and he has a variety of mechanisms to do that. NATO has claimed that the Russian forces still are on the border. Russia has denied that, but from our own satellite imagery analysis, we can see sizable Russian armed forces still not very far from Ukraine's border. By moving those units either closer to the border or exercising more overtly, or perhaps rotating units in and out, tensions can be ratcheted up or down. Russia also has what we can call agents provocateurs within the borders of eastern Ukraine. They can actually contribute to tensions going up or down. Although, of course, we have independent operations by Ukrainian government forces now, and they have something to bear on the situation. But looking beyond the situation on the ground, Russia also, of course, has its gas exports to Ukraine, and most notably they've threatened to cut those off unless Ukraine pays in full. Ukraine have said that we're not paying unless you go back to the old price that they were paying. And so to what extent Russia does or doesn't allow gas to go through Ukraine, for Ukraine, tensions can be raised or lowered. Well, I think probably not. Most obviously because he's already got what he wanted. He's achieved his main aims. Sevastopol is now permanently back in Russian control, so the home for the Black Sea Fleet is secure, and the buffer zone that Russia lost when Yanukovych fell has now been re-established in eastern Ukraine. If we were to look at the scenario of a Russian invasion, then much more than is currently the case, there would be swinging Western sanctions against Russia. And the European Central Bank has already reported that it believes that the capital flight from Russia to date has been $222 billion, which is 4 times what Moscow has said they were. So that's an economic reality that Putin has to be very mindful of. Thirdly, I think although the forces in the field, and estimates vary, but we're thinking maybe 25 to 30,000 professional troops in the field, would be enough to actually push into eastern Ukraine, to actually hold a border perhaps 100 or so kilometers west of where it currently is, would take more troops than that. And we have to look at the Russian armed forces and realize that a certain proportion of them are conscript forces. This is something like 80,000 out of something like 205,000 troops. So they have to be careful about how they use their professional troops and where they draw what from where. But I think the bottom line is Putin's already gained what he needs to gain, and he would perhaps be ill-advised to push things further. NATO's response was initially quite disappointing in that it could have moved quicker to put assets into those Eastern European relatively young allies within NATO who would have been very disturbed by what was going on in Ukraine. A lot of those assets are now in place, and US troops, for example, are exercising in a lot of these countries. And the NATO Baltic Air Policing mission has been bolstered by more aircraft than it would have normally. Longer term, though, NATO is going to have to wake up to a new paradigm in Europe, and that may not be back to the Cold War days, but Russia is clearly a nation pursuing great power status under Putin, and is prepared to be occasionally quite belligerent to make that happen. And so for all of those NATO allies now extricating themselves from more than a decade of counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, who thought that they could now decrease their defense budgets as they got out of those conflicts, are really going to have to think twice.